So this is the reference photo I'm going to be using today to base my painting on. I have my drawing ready to go. My paper has been wet on both sides. I just used a spray bottle to wet down both sides of the paper. That way it will stay wet a little longer, and that also means it will stay relatively flat and I don't have to tape it down to my board. My drawing is quite a bit more detailed than it usually is today because, for one, this is a kind of scene I've never tried to paint before. I've never painted a tropical scene. This is a scene from Brazil. Some beautiful banana trees and some palm trees. Really beautiful, lush vegetation. And I love the way that contrasts with the reddish earth that they have there. So I'm now in the first wash. And in the first wash, my main concern is just getting color on the paper. I'm not worried about details. I'm not really worried about the shapes of things. My focus is just getting down the base layer of color. Since watercolor is a transparent medium, it requires you to start with the lightest colors first. At least the way I learn to paint, that's how I do it. And since the paper is damp, I'm able to drop in all of these colors and you can see how they're blending together. And they create these beautiful soft edges that everything mixes and flows into itself. So the first stage is very impressionistic in that way. And you can see I'm kind of starting to add in the basic big shapes of the landscape, like those background trees, the big banana leaves. You'll also notice that I'm painting around certain areas, like these palm leaves here, because I wanted to preserve that spot for a different color. Now this base layer of color is going to show through the next layers that I add on because watercolor is transparent. And that's what gives it this beautiful glowing luminosity that I love so much about this medium. And you'll notice that I'm constantly varying the colors on my palette. No two greens are the same, no two reds or browns are the same. You may have noticed that I just quickly sprayed the back of the paper because there was a little ridge starting to form in the middle. And I discovered that if you take a small spray bottle and just spray that ridge, it will actually flatten itself out again. Now the paper is still going to curl up a little bit once it fully dries after the work is done, but that's easy enough to fix. You can just put a heavy book or something on top of it and that will fix it. So now my first wash is done, and it's time to move in to the second wash, which is all about finding the big connected shape. And in the second wash, my focus is going to be middle values. So I try to limit myself to only 3 values in my paintings, separate the picture into 3 values. So you've got lights, which is the first wash, mid value, which is the wash I'm in now, second wash, and then in the third wash, I'm focused on darks. And then at the very end, I will add some highlights with white gouache. You'll also see that here and there around the painting, I've intentionally left out certain areas. You'll see that certain areas are white. These are called incidental highlights, and this adds a feel of, it makes it look more natural and organic. It adds a little bit of intentional randomness to the work. So what I'm doing here is after I laid down those middle value colors, I'm taking the edge of my fingernail and I'm just scratching out lines to indicate grass. Just a few, not going too crazy with it. And I'm painting around these yellow and red dying banana leaves because I want those colors to really pop out. It's a technique called negative painting, where you're painting around the shape that you want to portray instead of painting the shape itself. It's pretty tricky at first, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes second nature, painting that way. So just adding some detail and shadows on the ground there. Now my main focus and goal with this middle value shape is to connect the entire shape across the painting. So you'll see that all of the detail in these trees and in the ground is connected and physically touching each other. When I paint that shadow on the ground, I go right from the edge of the bottom of the tree, I touch into that paint, and then I start painting the shadow. It's physically connected, and that will make the paint flow together, and it will create this beautiful, cohesive effect that just looks effortless and loose, which is exactly the style that I'm going for. I'm trying to constantly find that balance between loose and detail. I want it to look like it was just effortless and easy to paint. I really love the shape of these banana leaves against the sky. You'll also notice that there's a little figure sitting underneath the trees in the shade. Well, there's going to be shade in a minute here. I'm actually mixing up the color for the cat's shadow on the ground from those banana trees. And that figure helps give scale to the size of this landscape, and it also brings a little bit of human interest into the scene. Nothing too extravagant, and you almost might not even notice that figure sitting there at first. But as your eye is drawn into the painting, you'll eventually land right on him. All of the lines of the painting are kind of leading your eye towards that spot. So just adding in some more detail into this stand of banana trees and on the leaves especially, and more especially, I'm going to be adding detail on the edges of this stand of trees. Wherever there's the highest degree of contrast, so the darkest darks against the lightest lights, that's where I'm going to be adding the most detail. So, for example, against the sky, which is very light, I'm going to be really spending more time in adding the jagged edges of these leaves and adding in those branches that I'm doing now, because your eye is going to be drawn towards where the most detail and the most contrast is. And ideally, I would like to combine high contrast with high detail. It's a way of emphasizing a certain area of the painting by adding more detail and more contrast. Really liking how this is coming together so far. Now, I do have to be careful not to get too carried away with the amount of detail that I'm putting in here, because if you add too much detail, your painting can look overworked and fussy, and I don't want that. I want it to look loose and spontaneous and flowing. So I just took the edge of my finger for those background bushes and I rubbed the top of those shadows to soften the edge of it to give the impression of a curved surface, a curved shape, basically an approximation of a sphere, which is what most bush and tree shapes are. Obviously not banana trees or palm trees. So there again is an example of that negative painting where I painted around those palm leaves on the left-hand side because I wanted to preserve the bright, vibrant green of those palm leaves popping out against the background. That will help balance out the left side of the composition with the right. And then adding those far background palm trees will do that too. So here I'm just adding a glaze of more vibrant green onto these left-hand bushes because I realized that first wash was a little too dull. And that's the thing that happens with watercolor is as you continue to work the painting and add more layers, how the surrounding colors look will change and you might have to make some adjustments. Ideally, I would like to drop in that vibrant green immediately and not have to touch it again. But if I have to do a glaze once that paint is dry, it's really not that big of a deal. And sometimes I intentionally do that just to add more detail. So now I'm painting these background palm trees, and you'll notice that I'm physically connecting the shape of these trees. So right here, you'll see on the right-hand side of this tree, I'm touching it into the left-hand side of the tree next to it so that it's just one big shape. There's no separation between these trees physically. They're all connected into this big middle value shape. And one thing that I'm always doing while I'm painting is I'm squinting my eyes, which kind of abstractifies the scene for me, and it helps me to actually see this middle value shape more clearly. And then I'll squint my eyes at my painting and make sure that it's reading appropriately. So now that middle value shape is done, all the edges are connected, I'm happy with how it looks, so it's time to go add in the darkest darks. This is the stage where things really start to take on a three-dimensional appearance. Now, just like being careful not to add too much detail, I need to be careful not to go too overboard with the darks. I want to preserve as much of the light as I can, because again, your eye is going to be drawn towards the areas of highest contrast and highest detail, so I need to be very careful and intentional about the areas that I'm choosing to darken. And in the photo, there may be certain areas that are dark that I choose to not darken, because I don't want that area of the scene to be emphasized. So in the photo, there's this guy sitting under this tree, and he's actually got a bunch of gear, backpacks and stuff, leaning up against the tree. But in the painting, it's just a bunch of blobs. I'm letting the viewer of the painting decide what those blobs are in their mind. And in that way, the viewer actually becomes an active participant in the painting itself. And it becomes much more engaging. Instead of just painting everything as realistically as I can, I want to leave room for the viewer to participate in the process. So the figure is very, very simple. And in fact, everything else is quite a bit more simplified than the picture. There's just way too much detail in the picture itself to paint everything. And again, you don't want to paint everything. You want to leave room for interpretation. So I'm just going back and darkening up some of these banana leaves and really putting in some fine detail on the jagged edges of these leaves. By the way, I didn't realize how gigantic banana leaves are. They're like 10 feet long. It's wild. I don't remember if I mentioned this, but this scene comes from Brazil. Country I would love to visit someday. And you'll notice on the right-hand side where I dropped in that bright red for those dying banana leaves. They're really popping out now because I put such dark colors around it. And that's a way that you can bring out lighter colors even more, is by adding darker colors around it to increase the contrast. So just adding a little more detail in some of the surrounding foliage. Just adding some texture into there. It was looking a little flat. Mixing up some more vibrant green for the edges, the lit edges of these banana leaves. Because just like that bush on the left-hand side, I realized the yellows and the greens that I had mixed before was a little too washed out. And I really want to portray that bright, vibrant, tropical green of these banana leaves. And that's easy enough to do. You just glaze right on over that original color, but make sure that you're doing that once it's dry. You don't want to do that while it's still wet, because that will actually lift up some of the paint from underneath, and it will look muddy. Now I'm getting close to the end of my painting here. I'm just going in with some gouache with my very small liner brush. It's pure white gouache. I just use it straight from the tube. I believe it's titanium white artist gouache. I have to be so very careful in this stage with my highlights. Honestly, even more so than with the darks. I'm being extremely careful in particular about what highlights I'm adding. For example, the veins of these banana leaves is something I wanted to emphasize, because in the photo they're really popping out and they're just adding this amazing texture and depth to these leaves. And on the top of these leaves, I'm dragging my brush and allowing the paint to break up. Similar to a dry brush technique. And that creates a sparkling, shimmering effect. Now, gouache, unlike watercolor, will dry darker, and watercolor will dry lighter. So you always want to paint with watercolor a little darker than you think it needs to be, and then with gouache a little lighter than you think it needs to be. So just adding in a few areas of pure white to add a little bit of sparkle and heighten that contrast and further add interest to this main focus of the painting. And at the very end, I'm just going to splatter some gouache just by tapping the brush, but we'll get to that in a minute. So just adding some highlights on that figure, on his arm, on his leg, just a few lines, as basically doing as little as I possibly can to get the point across with the gouache. And here's that splattering. This is one of my favorite parts. It just adds this sparkling atmosphere to the whole painting. Makes it look alive and vibrant. Now we're just going to throw my signature on there and we'll be done. So I really hope you enjoyed getting a look into my thought process with this painting. And here you can see some of that granulation I was talking about before in the texture of the paint itself. And there we have it. Hopefully I'll see you on the next one.